On the night of September 3rd, 2023, an audience of more than 500 people packed into the Municipal Theater José Bor in Punta Arenas, Chile, a city perched at the very tip of the South American continent, closer to Antarctica than to Chile's capital, Santiago. When the final notes of the evening faded, the crowd rose to its feet. The work they had just heard was called Cantata Nuestra Madre Grande, Our Great Mother, a piece of neo-folkloric music that had been written nearly 50 years earlier by 3 young men who were imprisoned nearby, not far from this very theater, for the crime of their political beliefs. In this video, we're going to follow the journey of that piece of music, from a concentration camp on a remote island to a theater stage half a century later, and ask what it means to remember through song. My name is Lydia Harbach, and I'm a music researcher currently based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I had the pleasure of meeting Marko Bartisevich, one of the creators of the cantata, during 2 years of fieldwork in Punta Arenas, which got this whole project started. The video you'll see builds on interviews I conducted with cantata musicians and creators, as well as my own experience of seeing the cantata come to life as a fully orchestrated stage work almost 50 years after it was written. In fact, I was lucky enough to sit in on rehearsals and attend the premiere. While I can't recreate the emotional impact of those performances in a YouTube video, it's my goal that this video sheds light on the impacts of Chile's dictatorship in the extreme south of Chile, and the ways in which political prisoners musically created hope during dark times. To understand the cantata, we have to go back to September 11th, 1973, a date that carries very different weight in Chile than it does in the United States. On that day, Chile's military staged a coup against President Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist whose administration had brought sweeping social reforms and inspired a vibrant political song movement called Nueva Canción Chilena, or Chilean New Song. Allende died in the presidential palace. General Augusto Pinochet seized power and immediately began what would become 17 years of dictatorship. The repression was swift and widespread. Political opponents, university students, union organizers, teachers, artists were arrested across the country. In the southern city of Punta Arenas, detentions began on September 12th, the next day. Over the following weeks, hundreds of people were rounded up. Among them were 3 men in their 20s, Manuel Luis Rodriguez Uribe, Fernando Alejandro Lanfranco Leberton, and Marco Antonio Bartisevich Sapunar. They did not yet know what was about to happen to them, or what they would create together. On December 21st, 1973, political detainees from Punta Arenas were transferred to Dawson Island, a remote, wind-battered piece of land in the middle of the Strait of Magellan. There, at a concentration camp called Rio Chico, they were put to work in brutal conditions. They were subject to torture, including electrocutions, beatings, simulated executions. They slept in barracks, performed forced labor, and had almost no connection to the outside world. And yet, in the middle of all of this, Manuel Rodriguez began to write poetry. Between December 1973 and February 1974, he composed a long poem, an allegory for the American continent, imagined as a great indigenous mother whose children were fighting for freedom. Fernando Lanfranco set that poem to music, drawing on the sounds of Nueva Canción, Chile's politically charged folk revival, and rhythms from across Latin America. And Marko Bartisevich transcribed everything into musical notation, making sure that the work could survive whatever happened to its creators. Manuel Rodriguez would later reflect, "The only way we had to get out of that cesspit was to imagine other worlds, other realities, other moments." The composition process continued even after the men were transferred to the Punta Arenas public jail. Bartisevich finished the score in April 1976, just before he and Lanfranco were forced into exile. Lanfranco to Ireland, Bartisevich to Yugoslavia, and Rodriguez was released to internal exile within Chile. The score was smuggled out of prison, hidden, and preserved. The finished version of the cantata contains 10 songs. They're linked together with narration and a storyline that covers the history of the Americas from a pre-colonial era of indigenous empires like the Aztec, Maya, and Inca through a utopian future. You're about to hear some examples from the 2023 orchestral premiere of the work. It's about 30 minutes long, so I'd highly recommend that you listen to it in its entirety. I'll link that below. But remember, as you're listening, that this cantata was originally composed in prison with just voice and guitar. The first number, Introducción, covers prehistoric times through the arrival of Spanish colonists to the Americas. The vocal and instrumental parts mimic sounds from nature, like birds and ocean waves.
Como vientre originario, levantaron 3 dominios, y fue hazaña forjadora en la era precolombina.
The second song, Una mañana más tardía, describes the Spanish conquest and colonial era through the 19th century. Here we hear the interplay between the rhythms of a march and that of a trote, a fundamental Andean rhythm meant to represent indigenous resistance to colonization.
Atlántico extranjero, con la espada y la cruz de la metrópolis.
Y rasgaron tus telares, y tus toldos derrumbaron.
Torcieron tu rumbo para hacerte civilizada.
Next, Los Nueve Altivos describes Latin American independence movements from European colonial powers in the mid-1800s and 1900s. The song rises in rhythmic and dynamic intensity, ending with the choir's powerful announcement of the named key figures in Latin American independence. Songs, according to the cantata creators, lie at the heart of the work. Prometida de tus hijos, estabas en manos que no eran las tuyas, and Nuestra Madre siente dolor, all describe the conditions that led to popular uprisings across the American continent when young governments failed to deliver equitable living conditions for their constituents. You can really hear the folkloric influence in Estabas en manos que no eran las tuyas, which is written in the style of an Argentinian genre called samba. Listen for the rhythmic interplay between the drums and guitar in this excerpt.
Y las cadenas milenarias comenzaron a ser puños irreverentes.
Next, Dos Millas draws comparisons between the 1959 Cuban Revolution and the 1970 election of Salvador Allende in Chile. Musically, this song draws in rhythms from the Caribbean Guajira genre to represent that Cuban connection. The narration of this song ends with the following lyrics: Cada uno de nosotros presiente, que te encenderás de luz, which translates to, each of us senses, we sense that you will be filled with light. For the creators of the cantata, this song offered hope even in the midst of suffering and darkness in prison.
Mas entiendes que la vida nueva renacerá nueva vida y reverdecerá nueva la incontable generación.
The final songs, Cada paloma blanca, Será el tiempo, and Hacia la luz, offer additional optimistic imagery from nature. The lyrics speak of a new dawn, hopeful futures, and escapes to heavenly realms. We hear a strong Chilean musical influence in Cada Paloma Blanca, which uses rhythms from Chilean cueca to represent better times on the way for Chile.
Ni manos de dedos separados, a un gusto no quedarán. Cada pajarito volará, la congoja.
To appreciate the cantata, it helps to know a little about the musical world its creators came from. By the late 1960s, Latin America was experiencing a powerful musical and political movement. And in Chile, it was called the Nueva Canción Chilena, as I mentioned before, Chilean New Song. Musicians used Andean folk instruments like the charango and the quena alongside acoustic guitars, setting socially conscious lyrics to music that drew on pan-Latin American indigenous and rural traditions. We can hear this in the cantata in the inclusion of Chilean cueca, Caribbean guajira, and Andean trote, for example. This music became closely linked with Allende's socialist political project and with the idea that culture was a form of resistance. When the coup happened, the movement was immediately targeted. Many musicians were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The murder of celebrated singer-songwriter Victor Jara, whose hands were broken before he was executed, became one of the defining atrocities of the regime. It was not until April 2023, nearly 50 years later, that his killers were officially sentenced. It was for these reasons that the authors of the cantata never explicitly mentioned their own imprisonment, the dictatorship, or even Chile in the work. Like many of the songwriters of this period, they used metaphor and allegory to veil their political message. As active members of the left-leaning movement and passionate musicians, Rodriguez, Lanfranco, and Bartisevich were deeply familiar with and inspired by the songs of the Nueva Canción movement. The cantata they created behind bars was a continuation of that movement, and it was proof that the regime could not silence musicians entirely. Fast forward to 2021. After decades of exile and dispersal, the three men found each other again through the power of social media and word of mouth after having all returned to Chile. They decided it was time to share the cantata with the world. The timing was deliberate. September 2023 would mark the 50th anniversary of the coup. In November 2021, they formally established the Asociación Cultural Nuestra Madre Grande to manage the project. Over the next 2 years, they assembled musicians, secured funding from local and regional governments, collaborated with the University of Magallanes, the local university there in Punta Arenas, and verified the original text and score, which had been smuggled out of prison years before. On September 3rd, 2023, the full orchestral premiere took place before an audience of more than 500 people, myself included. The performance brought together 34 artists, guitarists, a charango player, percussionists, narrators, 7 vocal soloists, and a 22-person chorus of music students from the University of Magallanes. Musical direction was led by Fernando Alarcón. The event carried significant symbolic weight. It was introduced by a video message from then-President Gabriel Boric and was attended by the Minister of Culture, Carolina Arredondo, recognition from the highest levels of the Chilean government of what the cantata represented. The concert ended with Tamo Daleko, a traditional Croatian song that had become an anthem of longing and hope among the prisoners of Dawson Island.
Tamo Daleko, Daleko kraj mora.
That the story of Dawson Island isn't better known is simply geography. Punta Arenas sits more than 3,000 kilometers south of Santiago. That's further from Chile's capital than New York is from Los Angeles. Dawson Island is even more remote, accessible only by sea. The isolation that made the island a useful site for a concentration camp is the same isolation that has kept its story out of mainstream historical narratives. Most accounts of the Pinochet dictatorship center on Santiago, on the detention centers there, and on the figures who were imprisoned or exiled from the capital. The experiences of Chileans in the far south have received far less attention, in part because the journalists, academics, and documentarians who have been telling these stories were themselves often based in Santiago or even abroad. The cantata and its creators are explicitly pushing back against this erasure. By premiering in Punta Arenas, by building an association rooted in Magallanes, and by producing a book and documentary centered on the region's experience. They are insisting that this history belongs to the national record, not just to local memory. Scholars who study music and memory, including researchers like Ana Maria Ochoa, have written about how musical performance can do something that written history cannot. It makes the past physically present. When you hear a melody that was written in a prison cell, you are not just reading about suffering, you are in some small way sharing that moment with the people who created it. For the creators of the cantata, that is precisely the point. They describe their work as not just personal testimony, but as a gift to future generations, and as a way of keeping memory alive without letting it become merely grief. They write in their book, quote, "We tell this story to give testimony to those acts, and because many of our young generation were part of and actors in an intense era of tragedy. Each of us were thrown out in unexpected directions, and we found each other again in 2021 after returning to our homeland. We decided that the cantata needed to be shared," end quote. And Rodriguez is clear that the cantata's purpose is not only retrospective. He says, quote, "We have the responsibility to go beyond saying, yes, we experienced this trauma, but we keep on living. We have another life. We look to the future. We walk towards another destiny," end quote. In September 2024, the Asociación Cultural Nuestra Madre Grande premiered a feature-length documentary called Isla Dawson, Un Canto en la Adversidad, continuing their project of making this history visible. The work is ongoing, and links to the performance, documentary, and association website will be copied in the comments of this video. In the program notes for the cantata, Rodriguez, Lanfranco, and Bartisevich describe why they felt they had to create something, even in a concentration camp. They wrote, quote, "It was important for us to send a message to our jailers that art and culture belong to us as a people, that they arise out of reason and not brutality," end quote. 50 years later, the message of Nuestra Madre Grande has arrived at a standing ovation in a theater at the end of the world, and now, through this lecture, to you. Thank you for listening.